close your eyes for a moment, and imagine stepping off a ship onto Long Wharf in Boston, sometime around the year 1720. The air smells of salt water, with smoke, and something less pleasant, the accumulated sense of a growing port city where thousands of people live pressed together along crooked streets that follow the old cow paths of an earlier time. This is Boston in the 1700s, a city balanced between the wilderness of the New World and the distant memory of England. It's a place where ordinary people, not the governors or wealthy merchants we read about in history books, but the shopkeepers, the sailors, the serving girls, the apprentices, the widows running boarding houses, lived lives both remarkably different from and strangely similar to our own. Over the next several hours, we'll walk through their worlds slowly, carefully, examining how they woke each morning, what they ate, how they worked, how they loved and married, how they faced sickness, how they entertained themselves, and how they understood their place in a society that was still inventing itself. There's no rush here. We have time to notice the small details, the textures of daily existence that made up the reality of life in this colonial port town. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's step back through the centuries together. The day began early in 1700s Boston, though not quite as early as you might imagine. Despite what we often assume about our hardworking ancestors, most ordinary Bostonians didn't rise at the crack of dawn unless their occupation demanded it. The city itself determined the rhythm of life through the ringing of church bells, which marked the hours and called people to various activities throughout the day. Most households woke somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning during summer months, perhaps an hour later in the dark winter. But waking up in colonial Boston was a fundamentally different experience than pulling yourself from bed in our modern age. There were no alarm clocks, of course, though some wealthier families owned expensive timepieces that had to be wound daily. Most people simply woke when their bodies told them to, when the light changed, when they heard their neighbors stirring, or when the morning bells rang from the Old South Meeting House or the First Church. The bed you woke in revealed much about your station in life. A prosperous artisan might sleep on a proper bedstead with a mattress stuffed with feathers, covered with linen sheets and woolen blankets. The bedstead itself would be enclosed with curtains, not for privacy in our modern sense, but for warmth. Colonial homes were drafty affairs, and the bed curtains created a smaller space that could be warmed by body heat. Many people wore caps to bed, not as a quaint custom but as a practical necessity against the cold. But most ordinary Bostonians didn't enjoy such comfort. A laborer's family might share a single straw-filled mattress, or even sleep on loose straw covered with a blanket, arranged on the floor or on a simple platform. Servants and apprentices often slept in the attic spaces of their masters' homes, or in small rooms off the kitchen where the fire's warmth might reach. In the poorest households, several people might share the same sleeping space, sometimes in the same bed, a practice that seems strange to us now but was completely normal then, driven by the simple need for warmth and the scarcity of space. Rising from bed, you wouldn't immediately wash your face with water. This surprises many people, but washing the entire body, or even the face, with water every morning wasn't considered necessary or even healthful in the early 1700s. Instead, people wiped their faces with a dry cloth, perhaps splashing a bit of water on their hands. The prevailing medical theories of the time suggested that water could open the pores and let in dangerous airs and humors. Cleanliness was important, certainly, but it was achieved through regular changes of linen undergarments, which absorbed the body's sweat and oils. A person who changed their linen shirt or shift daily was considered clean, regardless of how often they bathed their skin. The morning routine involved dressing, which was more complicated than simply pulling on clothes. Women wore shifts as undergarments, then petticoats, then the outer gown or skirt and bodice. The layers served both modesty and warmth. Men wore linen shirts, breeches that buttoned at the knee, stockings, and waistcoats. Getting dressed required assistance in many cases. Buttons and laces weren't always reachable, especially for women's garments. This is partly why domestic servants were so common even in moderately prosperous households. Daily life simply required more hands. After dressing came breakfast, though this meal was much lighter than we might expect. Many ordinary people broke their fast with simply a piece of bread and perhaps some beer. Yes, beer for breakfast, because it was safer than water, which could carry disease. Children drank beer too, though it was often a weaker, small beer, with lower alcohol content. Some families might have porridge made from cornmeal, or hasty pudding as it was called. Bostonians ate a lot of corn in various forms, much more than English people back in England, simply because it grew so reliably in New England's soil. The morning hours were for work, which we'll discuss in detail later. But it's worth noting here that the workday wasn't structured as ours is. There was no 9-to-5 schedule, no real separation between work and home for most people. Artisans worked in shops attached to their homes. Merchants did business in ground-floor rooms while their families lived upstairs. Servants worked in the same houses where they slept. This meant that daily life was more fluid, more integrated. A woman cooking dinner was working, certainly, but she was also at home, and might pause to nurse a baby or instruct a child while she worked. As evening approached, the pace of life slowed. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so most ordinary families didn't light them until necessary. They ate supper while daylight remained, usually the main meal of the day, featuring whatever combination of bread, meat, vegetables, and pudding the household could afford. After supper came a few hours of what we might call leisure, mending clothes, telling stories, perhaps reading if someone in the household had that skill, which many didn't. By 9 or 10 o'clock, most Bostonians were in bed. The city grew quiet except for the watchmen making their rounds, calling out the hours and checking that all was well. Sleep came easier then, perhaps, after a day of physical labor and without the artificial lights and stimulations of our modern world. Though whether people slept more peacefully is harder to say, they had their own anxieties, their own nighttime worries about disease, fire, Indian attacks, or simply making it through another Massachusetts winter. Food dominated the consciousness of ordinary people in 1700s Boston to a degree we can barely comprehend today. Not because they were starving, most years, most people had enough to eat, but because acquiring, preparing, and preserving food consumed an enormous portion of every day and every penny earned. The diet of an ordinary Bostonian in the 1700s was repetitive, starchy, and by our standards, rather bland. The foundation of nearly every meal was bread, and we need to understand how different bread was in their world. This wasn't the fluffy white sandwich bread we know. Colonial bread was dense, heavy, often made from a mixture of wheat and rye, or wheat and corn. In harder times or among poorer families, it might be mostly cornbread, which was cheaper but considered inferior to wheat bread. The phrase, "earning your daily bread," was quite literal. For many families, bread and other grain-based foods provided the bulk of their calories. A typical ordinary household baked bread once a week, usually on Saturday. This wasn't a simple matter of mixing flour and yeast and popping it in the oven. The housewife, and it was almost always the wife, or a servant under her direction, had to maintain a sourdough starter, mix the dough in a large wooden trough, kneaded extensively by hand, set it to rise in a warm place, then transferred the heavy loaves to the baking oven, which had to be heated separately by burning wood inside it, then sweeping out the ashes and quickly getting the bread in before too much heat escaped. Many ordinary families didn't have their own ovens and instead took their bread to a communal baking house, paying a small fee to have their loaves baked. This meant that bread baking day involved not just preparation but also transportation, carrying heavy dough through the streets to the baking house, then returning later to collect the finished loaves. A week's worth of bread for a family of 6 or 7 people was not a light load. Beyond bread, the diet centered on whatever could be preserved through the winter months. Salt pork and salt beef appeared at most meals, though the salt content was so high by our standards that the meat had to be soaked before cooking to be edible. Fish was abundant in Boston, cod especially, which could be dried and stored. Dried cod became almost as ubiquitous as bread in ordinary diets. It appeared at breakfast, dinner, and supper in various forms, and while we might imagine this as a treat, contemporary accounts suggest people grew heartily sick of it. Vegetables were less common than we might expect, partly because refrigeration didn't exist and partly because prevailing dietary theories suggested raw vegetables were dangerous. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions could be stored in cellars through winter and were boiled extensively before eating. Cabbage appeared often, usually also boiled. Peas and beans, dried, were staples. But the fresh salads and vegetables we consider essential today were rare and appeared only briefly in summer months. Many people genuinely believed that fresh vegetables could cause illness, especially in children. Fruit was treated with similar suspicion. Apples were the most common fruit, but they were primarily used for making cider, which everyone drank constantly, men, women, children. Hard cider was the standard beverage with meals, safer than water and expected as part of a laborer's wages. Families put down apples in the fall to ferment, producing barrels of cider that would last through the year. The alcoholic content varied, but even small beer and weak cider contained enough alcohol to be mildly intoxicating. Colonial Bostonians lived in a state we might call lightly, permanently tipsy, though they'd have found this observation ridiculous since this was simply normal life. Meat beyond salted pork and beef was a sometimes thing. Chicken appeared on ordinary tables, as did pigeons, which were common in the city. More prosperous artisan families might have fresh pork or beef occasionally, but fresh meat was expensive and spoiled quickly. There were no refrigerators, remember, no ice in summer except what might be stored in underground ice houses by the wealthy. Meat had to be eaten the day it was butchered or preserved immediately through salting, smoking, or in winter, freezing. The actual preparation of food was labor-intensive beyond modern imagination. Every meal was cooked over an open fire and the hearth. This required maintaining the fire constantly, judging its heat, knowing when to add wood and when to let it burn down. Pots hung on hooks that could be swung over the flames or away from them. Skilled cooks could manage several dishes at once, rotating pots and pans to hotter or cooler spots. But this skill took years to develop, and the work was hot, smoky, and dangerous. Women's clothing caught fire with tragic regularity. Burns were common. The physical labor of lifting heavy iron pots, hauling water, chopping vegetables with dull knives, all of this made cooking an exhausting daily task. Water itself was a constant concern. Few houses had wells in the early 1700s. Water had to be carried from public pumps or purchased from water carriers who walked the streets selling it. This meant that washing dishes, or anything else, was done sparingly. Plates were wiped clean between meals rather than washed. Cooking pots were scoured with sand. The modern instinct to run water freely for any purpose would have seemed insane to a colonial housewife who just carried 2 heavy buckets a quarter-mile from the nearest pump. Food waste as we know it barely existed. Everything edible was eaten. Bones were boiled for broth. Vegetable scraps went into soup or to pigs if the family kept them. Stale bread was turned into pudding. The concept of throwing away food that was still technically edible would have struck ordinary Bostonians as criminally wasteful. This wasn't about morality so much as economics. Food was too expensive, too labor-intensive to acquire and prepare, to waste any of it. For the poorest Bostonians, meals could be desperately meager. A laborer's family in hard times might survive on bread and beer alone, perhaps with some thin soup. Children in poor families often showed signs of malnutrition. Rickets was common, as were various vitamin deficiencies we've now forgotten about. The charity system in Boston included provisions for distributing food to the desperately poor, but this was considered shameful, a last resort that marked you as unable to provide for yourself. Yet there were also moments of plenty. Thanksgiving, though not yet the formalized holiday we know, was celebrated with genuine feasting in many households. Election Day, when the colony's officials were chosen, was a citywide celebration with special cakes and foods. Christmas was downplayed by the Puritan culture of Boston, but other holidays brought special meals. And in summer, when fresh vegetables appeared briefly and could be afforded, when meat might be more available, the ordinary diet improved noticeably. The relationship with food in 1700s Boston was intimate and immediate in ways we've lost. People knew the seasons intimately because their diet changed with them. They understood preservation because their winter survival depended on it. They valued food in a way we struggle to replicate, not out of some noble simplicity, but because getting enough to eat was never entirely certain, was always work, and never something to be taken for granted. To understand how ordinary people lived in 1700s Boston, we need to understand how they worked, because work shaped everything else: where they lived, whom they married, how they saw themselves, and what future they could imagine for their children. The most important thing to grasp is that the modern concept of having a job didn't exist for most people. You didn't go to work. Work was woven into the fabric of daily life. The separation of workplace and home, of work time and personal time, hadn't yet been invented. A shoemaker worked in a shop attached to his house. A merchant's office was a room in his home. A baker lived above the bakery. Servants lived with their employers. This integration meant that work never really stopped, but it also meant it never felt like you were leaving life behind to go labor somewhere else. Let's start with the largest category of workers: artisans and craftspeople. Boston in the 1700s was home to dozens of trades. There were rope makers serving the shipping industry, essential because ships required miles of rope and it wore out constantly. There were coopers making barrels, crucial in an age when nearly everything, food, water, goods for shipping, was stored in wooden barrels. There were blacksmiths, silversmiths, pewtersmiths, candle makers, soap makers, tanners treating animal hides into leather, cordwainers making shoes from that leather, tailors, seamstresses, wig makers, printers, shipwrights, joiners and carpenters, glaziers, painters, and countless others. Each of these trades operated on the apprenticeship system, which was so central to colonial life that we need to understand it in detail. A boy, and it was almost always boys for most trades, would be apprenticed around age 12 or 14 to a master craftsman. The apprenticeship contract was legally binding and typically lasted 7 years. During this time, the apprentice lived with the master's family, worked in the shop, and learned the trade. In exchange, the master provided food, lodging, and training. The apprentice received no wages, though at the end of the term, the master typically provided a set of tools and perhaps a new suit of clothes. The apprentice system sounds exploitative to modern ears, and sometimes it was. Masters could be cruel. Apprentices could be worked brutally. But the system also provided real security and opportunity. An orphan boy could learn a trade and become a master himself eventually. The system was a way of training skilled labor, but also of integrating young people into adult society, teaching them not just craft skills but how to run a household, conduct business, behave in society. After completing apprenticeship, a young man became a journeyman, literally, someone who was paid by the day, from the French, journey. Journeymen worked for wages, lived independently, and saved money with the goal of becoming a master themselves someday, opening their own shop. Not everyone made it to master status. Some worked as journeymen their entire lives. But the possibility existed, and that possibility shaped the ambitions of ordinary working men. Women's work followed different patterns. The law prohibited women from most formal trades, and they couldn't sign contracts without a husband's or father's permission. Yet women worked constantly, and in a staggering variety of ways. Every household required what we now call domestic labor: cooking, cleaning, laundry, making and mending clothes, caring for children, and this work was intensive and skilled, though unpaid and often invisible in historical records. But many women also worked for money. Widows often continued their late husband's trade, A cooper's widow might run the cooperage with hired journeymen. Women ran taverns and boarding houses, worked as seamstresses and mantua makers, makers of women's gowns, took in laundry, worked as midwives, sold goods at market stalls, made and sold butter and cheese, taught children, worked as servants, and sometimes engaged in semi-legal activities like brewing and selling liquor from their homes. Domestic service was one of the most common occupations for young women. A girl might go into service at 12 or 13, working as a maid in a prosperous household. She'd clean, help with cooking, mind children, run errands. The work was hard and the hours endless, but she received room and board plus small wages, and she learned household management skills that would serve her when she married and ran her own home. Many young women spent several years in service, saving their wages, before marrying. The waterfront employed huge numbers of men. Boston was a port city, and the docks and related industries dominated the economy. Sailors themselves were often transient, but longshoremen, ship's carpenters, sailmakers, and others connected to maritime trade were permanent residents. The work was dangerous and physically demanding. Men loaded and unloaded cargo in all weather. They repaired ships in dry dock. They maintained the wharves themselves, which required constant work as wooden structures in salt water deteriorated quickly. Laborers without specialized skills took whatever work was available. They dug ditches, hauled goods, loaded wagons, carried water, cleaned streets, when anyone bothered, and performed countless other tasks that required muscle but no particular training. This work was irregular and poorly paid. A laborer might work 3 days one week and none the next. Day laborers were the most economically vulnerable people in the city, living hand to mouth, always one illness or injury away from destitution. The workday was long, typically sunrise to sunset, though this varied by trade and season. But we shouldn't imagine people working with constant intensity for 12 or 14 hours. The pace of work was more irregular. An artisan might work intensely for several hours, then pause for a meal or conversation, then work again. Shops closed for midday dinner. People stopped work to observe religious occasions. In many trades, Monday was notoriously unproductive. Saint Monday, as it was called, because workers were still recovering from Sunday drinking. Wages tell us a lot about how ordinary people lived. A skilled artisan might earn 30 to 40 pounds a year in the early 1700s. A journeyman might make 20. A laborer lucky enough to find steady work might earn 15. For context, a family needed about 30 pounds a year for a basic existence: rent, food, fuel, clothing. This meant that many families required multiple income sources. The wife's earnings from taking in sewing or selling butter might make the difference between subsistence and something slightly better. Children worked too, of course. By age 6 or 7, children were expected to contribute to the household, running errands, watching younger siblings, helping in shops or in household tasks. By 10 or 12, many were apprenticed or had gone into service. Childhood as a protected period of play and education was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Unemployment as we know it didn't exist as a concept, but underemployment was constant. Seasonal work meant many people had inconsistent income. Winter was particularly hard, construction work stopped, shipping slowed, many trades had less business. Families saved what they could during busy seasons to survive the slow times, but for many, winter meant hunger and debt. Yet work also provided identity and community. The artisan took pride in his skill, in producing a well-made shoe or a tight barrel. Tradesmen formed associations and looked after each other. Work connected people to networks of obligation and mutual support. Your master wasn't just your employer but your patron, expected to help you in times of trouble. Fellow artisans in your trade were not just colleagues but a kind of extended family, bound by shared knowledge and shared interests. The dream of most working people was independence, to be master of your own shop, to work for yourself rather than others, to employ apprentices and journeymen rather than be employed. This independence wasn't just economic but social and political. Only independent men who owned property could vote or hold office. Being a servant or journeyman your whole life meant permanent subordination. So young men scrimped and saved, worked extra hours, took risks, all in pursuit of that independence. For many, it was a dream that never materialized. They worked hard all their lives and died still working for others. But the possibility existed, and some achieved it, and that was enough to keep the system functioning and to give ordinary working people something to strive for in a world where most futures were predetermined by birth. Marriage in 1700s Boston was less about love and more about survival. Though this doesn't mean affection was absent, it simply wasn't the primary consideration. An ordinary person's marriage choices were shaped by economic necessity, social expectations, and the fundamental fact that running a household required two people performing different but equally essential roles. Young people generally married in their early to mid-20s, somewhat later than popular imagination suggests. Men needed to establish themselves in a trade and acquire some resources before they could support a family. Women needed a dowry of some kind. Even poor women were expected to bring something to the marriage, whether money, goods, or skills. This meant years of work and saving before marriage became possible. A young man completing his apprenticeship at 21 might work as a journeyman for several more years, living frugally, before he had enough to marry and set up independent housekeeping. The process of courtship was more supervised and less romantic than modern relationships. Young people met at work, at church, at neighborhood gatherings. A young man interested in a woman would seek permission from her parents to visit her. These visits took place in the family's main room with others present. The idea of a couple spending time alone together before marriage was scandalous. Courtship consisted of conversation, perhaps singing or reading together, a chance to assess each other's character and capabilities. Were they hardworking? Sober? Capable? These mattered more than passion. Parents had significant say in whom their children married, though by the 1700s, their power was more influence than absolute control. A parent couldn't force a child to marry against their will, but they could refuse permission, withhold dowry money, and make the marriage difficult or impossible through social pressure. Most young people understood that marriage required parental approval and tried to make choices their parents would accept. This led to marriages within similar social and economic groups. Apprentices married servants or shopkeepers' daughters. Farmers' children married other farmers' children. The wedding itself was a civil affair in early 1700s Boston. Massachusetts Puritans didn't consider marriage a religious sacrament, but a civil contract. Couples were married by magistrates, not ministers, though this changed later in the century. The ceremony was simple. A statement of consent before witnesses, signed contracts establishing the property arrangements. There might be a celebration afterward, a meal, perhaps some dancing for those who weren't strict Puritans, but elaborate weddings were for the wealthy. Once married, couples set up housekeeping, and here's where the economic reality of marriage becomes clear. A household in 1700s Boston wasn't just a place where a married couple lived, it was an economic unit. Almost a small business. The husband worked at his trade, whatever it might be. The wife managed the household, which meant not just cooking and cleaning but producing goods for use and sale, spinning thread, making candles and soap, preserving food, tending a garden if there was space, possibly keeping chickens or a pig. This division of labor was rigid and considered natural by both sexes. Men did men's work. Women did women's work. A man who performed tasks considered women's work faced mockery. A woman who tried to do men's work faced even worse. She could be legally punished for inappropriately taking on male roles. Yet the division, while rigid, reflected genuine interdependence. Neither gender could maintain a household alone. A widower needed to remarry quickly because he couldn't perform all the tasks necessary to maintain a home. A widow faced the same pressure, though she had slightly more options for surviving independently if she had some means. Children arrived quickly after marriage and continued arriving regularly. A woman might become pregnant 10 or 12 times during her childbearing years. Not all these pregnancies resulted in live births. Miscarriage was common. And not all children who were born survived. Infant mortality was terrible, with perhaps 1 in 10 children dying before their first birthday, and more dying before age 5. Disease, accidents, and the general hardships of life claimed children regularly. Every mother in 1700s Boston knew the grief of burying at least one child. This doesn't mean parents loved their children less than we do. The diaries and letters that survive show genuine affection and grief when children died. But parents couldn't afford to become too attached too early. Many waited until a child was several months old before even naming them formally. Emotional self-protection was necessary in a world where death was common. The household often included people beyond the nuclear family. Apprentices lived with the master's family. Servants slept in attic rooms or off the kitchen. Elderly parents might live with adult children. Orphan nieces or nephews were taken in. Journeyman workers boarded with their employers. The idea of a household being only parents and children was unusual. Most ordinary homes contained a shifting population of various people, all connected by work, kinship, or economic arrangement. Space was limited and privacy essentially non-existent. Most ordinary families lived in 1 or 2 rooms. Everyone slept in the same room, often multiple people to a bed. Dressing, undressing, washing, arguments, intimacy, everything happened in shared space with others present. Children learned about sex and death and all aspects of adult life simply through proximity. There was no way to shield them, no separate children's world, protected from adult realities. Marriage wasn't permanent in the way we often assume. Death dissolved marriages with frequency. A man might die in an accident at the docks, from disease, in a maritime venture. Women died in childbirth with tragic regularity. Perhaps 1 in 30 births resulted in the mother's death. A marriage lasting 20 or 30 years until old age was fortunate and somewhat unusual. When a spouse died, the survivor usually remarried, often quickly. This wasn't about lack of affection for the deceased but practical necessity. A widower with children needed a wife to care for them and manage the household. A widow needed a husband's income and legal protection. Second and even third marriages were common. This created complicated household dynamics, children from multiple marriages living together, step-parents and step-siblings, half-siblings, a tangled web of family relationships. Divorce existed but was extremely rare and difficult. The grounds were limited: adultery, abandonment, or sometimes extreme cruelty. The process required petitioning the colonial government and providing proof. Most unhappily married people simply endured their situation. Some abandoned their spouses, especially men who might leave for a sea voyage and never return. But for most, marriage was indeed until death, for better or worse. Yet within these constraints, genuine affection and partnership often developed. Letters between husbands and wives show concern, shared jokes, mutual respect. Couples who survived decades together often seem to develop real fondness. The marriage might have started as an economic arrangement, but living together, working together, raising children together, facing hardships together, these experiences created bonds. The household rhythm followed the patterns of work and season. Summer meant long workdays and relative plenty. Winter meant closer quarters, less work, more time together but also more tension from confinement. The household was the center of most people's lives, where they worked, ate, slept, raised children, grew old. It was simultaneously workplace, school, social center, and hospital. Understanding the household is understanding how most of life happened in 1700s Boston. Death was present in 1700s Boston in ways we've learned to forget. It wasn't hidden away in hospitals and nursing homes but happened at home, in the same rooms where people lived. It arrived suddenly and struck capriciously, taking the young as often as the old. Understanding how ordinary people dealt with illness and death tells us something essential about their experience of life. The first thing to understand is that people in the 1700s had almost no effective medical treatments. The germ theory of disease didn't exist. People didn't know what caused illness. The prevailing medical theory was still based on the ancient concept of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was thought to result from imbalances in these humors, and treatment aimed to restore balance through various means, almost all of which were useless or actively harmful. When someone fell ill, the first response was usually to call a family member or neighbor who had a reputation for healing skills. Every neighborhood had women, always women for ordinary families, who knew herbal remedies, who could bind wounds, who had experienced nursing sick people. These informal healers were the front line of medical care for ordinary Bostonians. They made teas from various plants, applied poultices, offered comfort and practical care. If the illness was serious or the family could afford it, they might call a physician. But physicians in the early 1700s had limited training and operated on medical theories that were fundamentally wrong. A typical physician's treatment might involve bloodletting, cutting a vein to let blood flow out, supposedly to balance the humors. Or purging, giving the patient powerful laxatives to clear their system. Or inducing vomiting. These treatments weakened already sick people and probably killed as many as they helped. Surgery was primitive and agonizing. There was no anesthesia except alcohol. Patients were held down while the surgeon cut. Operations were limited to things like amputations, removing bladder stones, or treating severe wounds. The survival rate was poor, and infection killed many who survived the operation itself. Most people avoided surgery unless facing certain death otherwise. Smallpox was the disease everyone feared most, and with good reason. It appeared in Boston in regular epidemic waves, killing perhaps 20 to 30% of those who caught it, and leaving survivors often scarred and sometimes blind. Children were especially vulnerable. During an epidemic, the city would try to isolate cases, but in the crowded conditions of early Boston, this rarely worked. Families would hang red flags outside homes where someone had smallpox, warning others away. Many fled the city entirely when epidemics struck. The introduction of inoculation, a precursor to vaccination, in the 1720s was controversial. The process involved deliberately infecting a healthy person with a mild case of smallpox in hopes they'd survive with immunity. It worked more often than not, but people died from inoculation too, and many considered it an ungodly tampering with divine providence. The debate split Boston into bitter factions. Other diseases were equally dangerous if less dramatic. Measles killed children regularly. Diphtheria, called throat distemper, could suffocate a child in days. Tuberculosis, called consumption, was common and almost always fatal, slowly wasting the victim over months or years. Pneumonia killed the elderly and weak every winter. Accidents and infections were constant threats. A small cut could become infected and kill through blood poisoning or lockjaw. Childbirth was perhaps the most dangerous thing women did. With no understanding of infection, no antibiotics, no ability to do cesarean sections safely, women died from hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, and various complications we now handle easily. Every pregnancy carried real risk. Women wrote their wills before going into labor, settled their affairs, said goodbye to older children. Some kept journals addressed to the babies they might not survive to raise. Midwives attended most births. These were experienced women, often older, who'd attended many deliveries. They knew techniques to turn babies in the womb, when to wait and when to act, how to handle the umbilical cord, how to care for mother and child afterward. A skilled midwife was valuable beyond measure. But even the best midwife couldn't handle serious complications. If labor went truly wrong, if the baby was positioned impossibly, if the mother hemorrhaged, there was often nothing to be done but watch and pray. mental illness was understood even less than physical disease. People who behaved strangely might be thought possessed by demons, or suffering from melancholy, or simply weak-minded. Families cared for mentally ill relatives at home when possible. The violently insane might be confined to the almshouse or even jailed. Treatment consisted mostly of restraint and isolation. The idea that mental illness might be treatable was still generations away. The sick were cared for at home by family members, usually women. There were no hospitals for ordinary people. The almshouse provided basic care for the destitute and insane, but that was a place of last resort, stigmatized and feared. When someone in a family fell seriously ill, life revolved around their care. Someone had to sit with them constantly, give them water, change soiled bedding, try to get them to eat. This care fell hardest on wives and daughters, who might spend weeks or months nursing a sick relative while still maintaining the household. Death, when it came, happened at home, in the same bed where the person had slept while healthy. The family gathered around. Ministers might be called to pray with the dying person and help them prepare their soul. There was a strong belief that how one died mattered, dying with faith, making peace with God and family, accepting death calmly. This was important. People wanted witnesses to their good death, evidence of their salvation. After death, the family prepared the body. This meant washing it, dressing it in a burial shroud or their best clothes, laying it out for viewing. The wake happened at home, with neighbors coming to pay respects. The body wasn't embalmed. It would decompose quickly, so burial came within a day or two. In winter, when the ground was frozen, bodies might be temporarily stored in tombs until spring burial was possible. Funerals were community events. Coffins were simple wooden boxes, often reused. The body would be removed at graveside and only the burial shroud went into the ground, with the coffin saved for the next death. The funeral procession walked through the streets to the burial ground. For ordinary people, the service was brief. Ministers preached funeral sermons, especially for prominent citizens, but common folk were buried with less ceremony. Mourning had its own rules and customs. Widows wore black for a year. Children mourned parents. But life couldn't stop for grief. Too much work needed doing. A widow with children couldn't afford extended mourning. She needed to remarry, to secure her family's survival. Grief was real but had to be contained, processed while life continued. Children were particularly vulnerable to death. Families expected to lose some children. It was unusual for all of a couple's children to survive to adulthood. Parents developed a kind of fatalism about child death, not because they cared less but because caring too much was unsustainable when loss was so common. Graveyards were full of small stones marking infant graves. Yet people also adapted and found ways to continue. They had more children, knowing some would die. They helped each other through illness, sharing knowledge and care. They found comfort in religion, which promised reunion in heaven and meaning in suffering. They accepted death as part of life in ways we've lost, either ignoring it nor being paralyzed by it. The ever-presence of death shaped how people lived. It made life both more precious and more precarious. It encouraged living in the moment. Tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. It strengthened community bonds, because you might need your neighbor's help tomorrow when illness struck. And it made the world feel more mysterious, more subject to divine will or fate, because so much happened that no one could explain or control. After exploring the hard realities of work, food, and death, we might wonder whether ordinary Bostonians had any time or energy for enjoyment. They did, though their entertainment looked different from ours, shaped by Puritan values, limited leisure time, and the simple realities of life without electricity or modern media. The Puritan culture that dominated early Boston viewed leisure with suspicion. Idleness was sinful. Time should be used productively. Yet even the strictest Puritans recognized that people needed rest and recreation. The key was that leisure should be useful, edifying, not frivolous or corrupting. This tension shaped what ordinary people did with their limited free time. Reading, for those who could read, was a primary form of entertainment and education. But literacy wasn't universal among ordinary people. Many could read printed texts but not write. These were taught as separate skills. Perhaps half of men in Boston could read, and fewer women, though the literacy rate was higher than in most of the world at that time. Boston had a strong tradition of education, with town-supported schools and a culture that valued reading, especially religious texts. For those who could read, the primary text was the Bible. Most households owned one, often the only book in the house. People read it regularly, not just for religious duty but for entertainment. The stories were dramatic, violent, romantic, the language beautiful. Beyond the Bible, there were religious works, sermons printed and circulated, spiritual memoirs and conversion narratives. But people also read for pleasure when they could afford it and find it. Almanacs were tremendously popular. These annual publications contained calendars, weather predictions, farming advice, astronomical information, jokes, poems, and practical wisdom. Every household wanted an almanac. They were used until they fell apart, then used for scrap paper. Newspapers began appearing in Boston in the early 1700s. The Boston Newsletter, first published in 1704, was read aloud in taverns and coffee houses where men gathered. Newspapers brought news from England and other colonies, announced ship arrivals, advertised goods for sale, and gradually became forums for political debate. For ordinary people, newspapers provided connection to a wider world beyond their immediate neighborhood. For women and those who couldn't read, storytelling was entertainment and education. Older people told younger ones family histories, moral tales, ghost stories, accounts of Indian captivities, a popular genre that mixed adventure and moral lessons. Stories were shared while working. Women told tales while spinning or sewing, men while doing repetitive work. This oral tradition passed down knowledge, values, and entertainment across generations. Music was woven into daily life. People sang while working, sea shanties for sailors, ballads and folk songs for others. Churches had psalm singing, though early Puritans were suspicious of elaborate music. By the mid-1700s, singing schools became popular, teaching ordinary people to read music and sing in harmony. These schools were social events as much as educational ones, giving young people a chance to meet and spend time together under respectable supervision. Musical instruments were less common among ordinary people. They were expensive and considered somewhat frivolous by strict Puritans. But Jews' harps, simple flutes, and drums appeared. By later in the century, fiddles became more acceptable, especially for dancing, which was controversial. Dancing was associated with disorder and sexual immorality by some, but others saw it as harmless fun. The debate continued throughout the period. Taverns and public houses were central to men's social lives. Boston had numerous taverns, ranging from respectable establishments to rougher dockside dives. Men gathered to drink, smoke pipes, play cards or dice, exchange news, discuss politics, argue about religion. Taverns served food and often provided lodging. They were community centers, where notices were posted, meetings held, business conducted. Women rarely entered taverns alone. It wasn't considered respectable. But they had their own social networks based around work and neighborhood. Women visited each other's homes, helped with major tasks like butchering or preserving food, attended births together, gathered for sewing or quilting. These gatherings combined work and socialization, conversation and mutual aid. Children's play was less supervised and structured than today. Children played in the streets, ran errands, invented games with whatever materials were at hand. Boys might swim in the harbor, play stick games, stage mock battles. Girls had dolls, played house, helped with younger children. Much play imitated adult work. Children naturally prepared for adult roles through play that looked like practice. Seasonal celebrations broke up the yearly routine. Election Day, when colonial officials were chosen, became a festival with special foods, games, and general celebration. Guy Fawkes Day was celebrated with bonfires and parades, though it often became an excuse for rowdiness. Thanksgiving was observed but not yet standardized. Christmas was officially ignored by Puritans, who considered it a Catholic superstition, but by the mid-1700s, some people marked it quietly. Public executions were considered both entertainment and moral education. When someone was hanged for murder or piracy, the entire town might turn out to watch. Ministers preached execution sermons, warning against sin. The condemned might give speeches from the scaffold. This seems horrifying to us, but it was seen as educational. Crime led to punishment, and witnessing that punishment supposedly deterred others. It was also dramatic, a break from ordinary routine. Less grim public events included militia training days, when men practiced military drills. These were partly serious. The militia was real and important, but also social occasions with food, drink, and socializing afterward. Lectures and visiting preachers drew crowds partly for the content but also for the spectacle and social opportunity. Craftsmen took pride in their work in ways that were almost recreational. A skilled cabinetmaker or silversmith found satisfaction in creating something beautiful and functional. Work wasn't entirely separated from art. The best craftsmen were artists, and their shops attracted admirers. This aesthetic satisfaction in work well done was a form of leisure, even pleasure, woven into daily labor. Gossip served as entertainment and social regulation. In a small, interconnected community, everyone knew everyone's business. Who was courting whom, who'd gotten drunk, whose business was failing, who'd had a baby too soon after marriage, all this was discussed endlessly. Gossip was how reputation was built or destroyed, how social norms were enforced, but also how people connected, found common cause, and entertained themselves. For the moderately prosperous, visiting and hospitality were important. Families would invite others for dinner or afternoon visits. These occasions required preparation, special foods, clean house, best manners, but they were also genuine entertainment. Conversation, news exchange, sharing food and company. This was how people maintained social bonds and broke the monotony of routine. Letter writing, for those who could write, was both communication and entertainment. Letters were shared and read aloud, circulated among friends and family. People saved letters, reread them, treasured them. Writing a letter was crafting something, choosing words carefully, creating a connection across distance. The arrival of a letter was an event, bringing news and connection from far away. Natural observation was entertainment for some. Walking through the countryside, observing plants and animals, noting the season's changes. These were free pleasures available to those who had the inclination and time. Some kept journals noting weather, bird arrivals, first frosts, garden progress. This attention to nature was partly practical but also aesthetic, a form of engaged observation that enriched daily life. Religious observance itself served partly as entertainment, though people wouldn't have phrased it that way. Sunday meeting was a social occasion as well as worship. People saw their neighbors, caught up on news, heard the minister's sermon, which might be intellectually engaging or emotionally stirring. The rhythm of the church calendar, the cycle of fast days and Thanksgiving days, gave structure and variety to the year. The limited leisure time ordinary people had was precious. After long days of physical labor, entertainment was often passive, sitting, talking, listening, rather than active pursuits. People were tired. Simple pleasures sufficed. A pipe of tobacco, a mug of cider, conversation with neighbors, a story told by the fire, these were enough. The constant stimulation we expect today would have seemed overwhelming, unnecessary. People found satisfaction in simpler things because they had no alternative, but also because the simplicity itself had value. It was human-scaled, face-to-face, rooted in immediate community rather than abstract or distant. To understand the final and perhaps deepest layer of how ordinary people lived in 1700s Boston, We need to grasp how they understood their place in society, how the community functioned, and how people navigated the rigid hierarchies that shaped every interaction while still maintaining personal dignity and self-worth. Boston in the 1700s was explicitly hierarchical. Everyone understood that society consisted of ranks and orders, with some people naturally superior to others. This wasn't hidden or considered shameful. It was the understood structure of how the world worked. God had ordained some to govern and others to labor. Accepting your station was considered a virtue. Aspiring above it was prideful and dangerous. The most fundamental division was between freemen and servants, or enslaved people. A freeman owned property, controlled his own labor, and had legal rights. He could vote, serve on juries, hold office if sufficiently prosperous. Servants and the enslaved had no such rights. They were subordinate, under the control of masters, their labor not their own. This division ran deep and shaped everything. Among freemen, there were further gradations. At the top of ordinary society were master craftsmen, substantial merchants, prosperous farmers, men of what we'd call the middle class, though that term didn't exist then. Below them were journeymen, small shopkeepers, less successful artisans. Below them, laborers and sailors, people who worked with their hands but owned little. The differences were marked in countless ways: how you dressed, where you sat in church, how others addressed you, whom you could marry. This hierarchy was visible and performed daily. The wealthy wore expensive cloth, silver buckles, fine wigs. Ordinary people wore rougher fabrics, simpler cuts. Laws actually regulated who could wear what, sumptuary laws designed to keep people dressed according to their rank. Though these laws were increasingly ignored by mid-century, the principle remained: your appearance should reflect your status. In church, seating was assigned by social rank. The wealthiest and most prominent families sat in the best pews up front. Ordinary people sat farther back or in the galleries. The poorest, servants, and black Bostonians, free or enslaved, sat in the worst seats or stood. Everyone knew where they belonged. Church seating was literally a map of the social order. Yet ordinary people weren't passive in this system. They found ways to maintain dignity and self-respect within the constraints. A master craftsman might be below the wealthy merchants in the formal hierarchy, but he had pride in his skill, in his independence, in being master of his own shop. He wasn't wealthy, but he wasn't a servant either. This middle position provided both status and self-worth. Reputation was crucial for ordinary people. You might not be wealthy, but you could be known as honest, hard-working, God-fearing, a good neighbor. Reputation determined your credit. Merchants would extend credit to those with good reputations and deny it to those without. It determined whom your children could marry. It affected whether you'd be chosen for minor civic positions like fence viewer or hog reeve, unglamorous roles but signs of trust and standing. The community enforced moral standards through gossip and social pressure. A man known as a drunkard faced consequences. Merchants might refuse him credit, masters wouldn't hire him, neighbors would avoid him. A woman with a reputation for sexual looseness was shunned, her marriage prospects destroyed. This informal policing of behavior could be harsh, but it also gave ordinary people power. They collectively decided who was respectable and who wasn't. Church membership was another marker of status and respectability. Being admitted to full church membership required demonstrating authentic religious experience and living a godly life. Members could participate in communion and have their children baptized. Non-members couldn't, and they faced social consequences. Yet many ordinary people were members in good standing, giving them a kind of status that wasn't purely economic. The town meeting was where ordinary male freemen exercised political voice. Boston's governance included annual town meetings where freemen could vote on local issues, elect officials, debate policy. Not everyone could participate. You needed property and freeman status. But this meant that successful artisans and craftsmen had real political power at the local level. They might not control the colonial government, but they had say in local affairs. Race and slavery complicated the social hierarchy. Boston had a population of enslaved black people and also free black residents. The enslaved were at the bottom of the hierarchy, property rather than people in legal terms, though they were also human beings with lives, families, and dignity they struggled to maintain. Free black Bostonians occupied an ambiguous position, legally free but facing discrimination, relegated to the worst jobs, excluded from most civic participation. The experience of ordinary black Bostonians deserves attention. Some worked as sailors, one of the few occupations relatively open to them. Others worked as laborers, servants, or in trades if they could find masters willing to train them. Free black families tried to build lives, buy property, raise children in a society that fundamentally didn't see them as equal. They formed their own community networks, helped each other, maintained dignity despite constant discrimination. Native Americans also lived in and around Boston, though in smaller numbers by the 1700s. Disease and conflict had devastated their populations. Those who remained often worked as laborers or servants, occupying a marginalized position in colonial society. Relations with nearby native communities were complex, mixing trade, tension, and occasional conflict. Gender hierarchy was as rigid as class and race. Men had authority over women, legally, socially, religiously. A married woman was femme covert, under the law, meaning her legal identity was covered by her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts, own property separately, or control her own wages without his permission. Yet women weren't powerless. Within their sphere, the household, child-rearing, social networks, women exercised authority and made decisions. The gender hierarchy was real but not absolute. Widows had more legal rights than married women. A widow controlled her late husband's estate, or her portion of it, and could conduct business, sign contracts, make legal decisions. Some widows became quite successful running businesses or managing property. This gave widowhood a certain independence that married women lacked, though the loss of companionship and economic security made it hardly desirable. Conflict within this hierarchical society was constant but usually managed through established channels. Disputes went to court, where even ordinary people could bring cases. The courts were accessible and used frequently. People sued over debts, property lines, contracts, slander. The law wasn't just for the elite. Ordinary people used it to resolve conflicts and seek justice. Community charity revealed both solidarity and hierarchy. Boston had systems for supporting the poor, the almshouse for the destitute, outdoor relief, support given to people in their homes, apprenticing poor children to learn trades. But charity reinforced hierarchy. It was given by those above to those below, and receiving it marked you as failed and dependent. People avoided it when possible, even choosing hunger over the shame of asking for charity. Yet neighbors helped each other informally in ways that didn't carry the same stigma. If someone's house burned, neighbors collected money to help them rebuild. If a man died, the community might care for his widow and children. If someone fell ill, neighbors helped with farming or brought food. This mutual aid was expected, part of being a good neighbor, and it operated separately from formal charity. The struggle for dignity and respect motivated much of ordinary people's behavior. They worked hard partly for economic survival but also to maintain respectability. They saved money to apprentice their children to good masters, giving them chances for advancement. They attended church, dressed as well as they could afford, obeyed laws, maintained their reputations, all to secure their place in the community and their family's future. Social mobility existed but was limited. A talented, hard-working artisan might become quite successful, train his sons in profitable trades, see them rise slightly above his own station. But dramatic upward movement was rare. Most people remained in roughly the station they were born into. This wasn't seen as tragic but as natural. Your station was where God had placed you, and finding contentment there was wisdom. Yet the very existence of some mobility, the fact that success was possible through skill and hard work, gave people hope and motivation. The son of a laborer might become an artisan. The grandson of an immigrant might own property. It took generations, but improvement was imaginable. This possibility, however distant, shaped how people thought about their lives and their children's futures. The community, for all its hierarchies and restrictions, provided genuine support and belonging. You knew your neighbors. You'd known them for years, maybe your whole life. They'd helped you through hard times, and you'd helped them. You worshipped together, worked together, celebrated together, mourned together. This web of connection gave life meaning and security that transcended individual success or failure. Understanding this social world helps us grasp how ordinary people made sense of lives that were, by our standards, incredibly hard. They found dignity in their place, however humble. They valued reputation and community respect. They took pride in their skills, their families, their faithfulness to duties. They weren't oppressed victims simply enduring life but active participants in a complex social world, navigating its rules, pushing against its limits when possible, finding satisfaction and meaning within its structures. We've walked slowly through the daily life of ordinary people in 1700s Boston, examining how they woke and slept, what they ate, how they worked, how they loved and married, how they faced illness and death, how they entertained themselves, and how they understood their place in their world. What we find is neither the romanticized past of nostalgic imagination nor the unrelenting misery sometimes portrayed, but something more complex and human. Life was hard by our standards. The physical labor was exhausting. Food was monotonous. Medical care was useless or harmful. Death came too easily and too often. The social hierarchies were rigid, opportunities limited, freedoms constrained by modern expectations. We shouldn't minimize these realities or pretend the past was better than it was. Yet people lived fully within these constraints. They found joy in simple pleasures, a good meal, a neighbor's friendship, a child's laugh, satisfaction in work well done. They created meaning through religion, family, community, craft. They helped each other through hardships. They told stories, sang songs, fell in love, raised children, and tried to make better lives for those who came after them. What strikes us most, perhaps, is how much of their experience remains recognizable. The specific details are foreign: the clothing, the food, the technology, the social structures, but the underlying human experience feels familiar. They worried about their children's futures. They took pride in doing their work well. They gossiped about neighbors. They fell in love, felt grief, experienced joy. They were fundamentally like us, living in a fundamentally different world. Understanding their lives gives us perspective on our own. The technologies and comforts we take for granted would seem like magic to them. Yet we might envy their strong communities, their integration of work and life, their direct connection to the sources of their food and shelter, the way their lives had clear meaning and purpose within their social and religious framework. The ordinary people of 1700s Boston are gone now, their individual struggles and triumphs mostly forgotten, their names appearing in no history books. But they lived, and how they lived mattered. They built the city, raised the children who came after them, created the culture and economy that evolved into our world. They deserve to be remembered and understood, not as statistics or abstractions, but as people who woke each morning and faced their lives with as much courage, dignity, and hope as any of us face ours. Rest now if you wish. Let these images of another time, another place, settle in your mind. The past is distant but not entirely foreign. And perhaps in understanding how others lived, we understand ourselves a little better too.